May 18, 1980, North Fork, Toutle Valley, Washington. Caterpillar D7 bulldozers sit in a river corridor that is about to stop behaving like a river. Within minutes, the valley will turn to moving ground, and machines built for the hardest work in the woods will begin to disappear. To understand why Caterpillar D7 bulldozers ended up entombed beneath nearly 30 feet of volcanic mud, you have to go back to the geography that made Mount St. Helens so dangerous. Long before May 1980, the mountain did not stand over empty wilderness. Its drainages fed logging country, road systems, bridges, gravel bars, camps, and maintenance corridors cut into the valleys of southwestern Washington. The North Fork Toutle River in particular was not just a river. It was a working industrial corridor, shaped by timber access, haul roads, and the machines needed to keep those routes open. By the late 1970s, Caterpillar D7s were common sight on that kind of ground. They were not the biggest crawlers in the woods, but they were among the most useful. A D7 had enough weight and blade to clear slide material, cut road benches, push spoil, and work unstable surfaces where wheeled equipment had no business going. Depending on series and setup, these machines ran in the roughly 40,000 to 50,000 pound class, with power sufficient for timber road construction, earth moving, and emergency access work. In steep country, that balance mattered. A larger machine could move more, but it also demanded better ground. A smaller machine might survive the terrain, but not the workload. The D7 sat in the middle, and that made it a natural choice in volcanic country, where roads, culverts, and stream crossings were already under stress. The story begins before the main eruption, when Mount St. Helens was already warning that the ground under every machine in the district was changing. In March 1980, the volcano entered a new phase of unrest. Earthquakes began, steam explosions followed, snow and ice around the summit were disturbed. Ash appeared. Crews in the surrounding river systems were no longer dealing with ordinary spring runoff or routine slope instability. They were working inside a landscape that was being mechanically reconfigured by heat, pressure, fractured rock, and meltwater. That distinction matters because lahars are not simply muddy floods. Mechanically, a lahar is a dense, fast-moving slurry of water. Ash, sand, pumice, timber, boulders, and volcanic debris. It behaves less like normal river flow and more like wet concrete in motion. When sediment concentration becomes high enough, it can carry logs like matchsticks, roll house-sized rock, bury bridges in minutes, and fill an entire valley floor deep enough to erase roads that had existed for decades. A crawler tractor caught in that kind of flow is not just facing water, it is facing moving ground. In the weeks before the catastrophic morning of May 18th, agencies, contractors, and industrial crews around the mountain were already improvising around closures and unstable access. Some heavy equipment had been shifted, some had not. Not every machine in the valleys below St. Helens was there as part of disaster response. Many were there because that was where the work already was. Logging roads needed maintenance, drainage structures needed attention. Access routes had to stay passable as conditions worsened. A bulldozer parked near a haul road or work area in the Toutle system might have been there for a completely ordinary reason a month earlier. Then the mountain failed. At 8:32 in the morning on May 18th, 1980, a magnitude 5.1 earthquake triggered the collapse of the volcano's north flank. What followed was not a single event, but a chain of them. The lateral blast flattened forest across hundreds of square miles. Pyroclastic material surged outward. Snow, glacier ice, and water were suddenly mixed with fresh volcanic debris on a massive scale. The upper drainages of the Toutle River system became the delivery channels for lahars almost immediately. Now the machine-centered part of the story comes into focus. In the valleys below the blast zone, there were Caterpillar D7s positioned in the path of what those channels were about to become. They were not fighting a fire line. They were not pushing cleanup spoil after the fact. They were simply in the wrong industrial corridor. At the exact moment that corridor ceased to behave like a river valley, and became a conveyor of debris. The lahars that came off Mount St. Helens moved with extraordinary force through the Toutle system. In some reaches, they were tens of feet deep. They undercut banks, tore out timber, smashed structures, and spread sediment across valley bottoms at a scale few operators in the region had ever seen. Eyewitness descriptions from the broader event often compare the sound to grinding rock, snapping timber, and continuous impact. That is important because it tells you what a parked or idled bulldozer was up against. Not just burial from above, but impact from all directions. Floating logs, rolling debris, hydraulic force, and then the final weight of settling mud. On paper, a D7 is built for punishment. Steel track frames, heavy finals, a robust main case, a machine meant to shove against resistance all day. But no crawler tractor is designed to survive being overtaken by a debris flow that can fill a valley floor and then harden around it. Once the first surge reaches the machine, the blade may catch debris. The tracks may be forced off level. The undercarriage begins to lose definition as material packs into every void. If the machine is running, ingestion becomes a danger. If it is shut down, that hardly helps. The real problem is burial load. As the lahar slows and deposits, the machine stops being a vehicle and becomes an object inside a settling mass. Some of the D7s in the Mount St. Helens drainages were not merely knocked over or partially covered. They disappeared into deposits so deep that later accounts placed them under roughly 30 feet of mud, ash, timber, and volcanic sediment. That number is not dramatic language. It is the difference between a difficult recovery and an almost impossible one. At that depth, you are not pulling a stuck dozer. You are excavating a machine out of a newly created geologic layer, and the terrain above those buried machines did not stabilize when the first flow stopped. That was the second problem. The eruption had transformed the entire watershed. Channels were choked. Drainage patterns were altered. Fresh sediment remained mobile. Additional flows and remobilized material continued to move through the system. Any attempt to locate or recover a buried D7 in the immediate aftermath would have meant sending men and machines into ground that was still changing by the hour. That is where Part 1 turns. Not at the moment of cleanup, but at the moment the machines were effectively erased. The Caterpillar D7s in the Toutle corridor had entered the crisis long before anyone could call it a recovery story. They were buried not by ordinary mud, but by a volcanic debris flow powerful enough to redraw the valley itself. And once that happened, the question was no longer whether the machines could be driven out. It was whether anyone could even find where the ground had swallowed them. What happened immediately after was not a clean transition from disaster to recovery. The North Fork Toutle Valley was still in motion. Fresh deposits were unstable. Channels were shifting. And the surface that looked solid in 1 hour could break, settle, or cut away in the next. Crews entering the area after May 18th were not walking back onto a damaged worksite. They were entering a new landscape laid down in a matter of hours. That is why the buried D7s matter. They mark the point where ordinary heavy equipment logic failed. On a normal job, a stranded bulldozer presents a sequence. Locate it, assess access, rig it, pull it, rebuild if necessary. Here, even the first step was uncertain. The machines had not been left in a recognizable cut, on a visible bench, or beside a road shoulder. They had been swallowed by valley-scale deposition. Roads were gone. Reference points were gone. In places, the valley floor itself sat dozens of feet higher than it had before the eruption. Mechanically, recovery was defeated by 3 things at once: depth, instability, and scale. A D7 buried under roughly 30 feet of lahar deposit is not just covered. Its blade, hood, cab structure, seat, control linkages, fuel system, and final drives are locked inside compacted volcanic sediment that may include ash, sand, cobble, broken timber, and waterlogged debris. Even if a crew could identify the exact burial point, they would still need to excavate downward through material that did not behave like uniform soil. Some layers would slump, others would hold, some would be saturated, others would crust over and conceal voids below. Every bucket removed could change the stress in the cut. On paper, larger machines might seem like the answer. Bring in bigger dozers, bring in drag lines, bring in excavators. But that assumes access and stable working platforms. In the months after the eruption, much of the practical machine work in the broader St. Helens zone focused not on salvaging buried equipment, but on restoring routes, controlling sediment, rebuilding crossings, and protecting downstream communities from what the volcano had put into the river system. The problem was no longer one lost machine or even several. The problem was an entire watershed carrying too much loose material. Then the margin disappeared in another way. The D7s themselves had ceased to be operational assets and become buried steel. The cost of finding and excavating them had to be measured against roads that needed to be reopened, bridges that needed replacement, channels that needed management, and ongoing hazard work across southwest Washington. In that kind of environment, recovery becomes a question of priority, not sentiment. A machine may be valuable. A valley full of unstable sediment is more urgent. That is the part many viewers outside heavy equipment miss. Abandonment is not always neglect. Sometimes it is a technical conclusion. If the machine lies too deep, if the access is too dangerous, if the material above it is still active, and if every hour spent chasing buried iron takes crews away from infrastructure that protects lives downstream, then the machine stays where it is. Not because no one cared, but because physics and triage made the decision. For the operators and contractors who knew those corridors before the eruption, that carried its own weight. These were not abstract assets in a ledger. A D7 on a mountain road job was a familiar machine. Men knew the sound of its engine under load, the wear pattern in its undercarriage, the way it sat on a slope, the way the blade responded in wet fill versus hard cut. To lose a machine that way, not to fire or rollover or mechanical failure, but to have an entire valley bury it out of sight, was something else. It meant the landscape had exceeded the scale of the equipment built to master it. In the years that followed, the Toutle system became one of the central engineering problems created by Mount St. Helens. Sediment management, dredging, channel control, and long-term flood risk dominated the response. The mountain had not only destroyed what stood in its path, it had loaded the river network with enough loose volcanic material to threaten communities far downstream if left unmanaged. That larger story helps explain why the buried D7s remained buried. The site had moved beyond machine recovery and into watershed engineering. What survived then was not the bulldozers as working machines, but the record of what happened to them. Their burial became evidence of force. A Caterpillar D7 is not a pickup truck, not a light utility vehicle, not something a flood simply nudges aside. It is a crawler tractor built for road building, earth moving, and sustained pushing under load. When a machine in that class disappears beneath a lahar deposit, the event no longer needs exaggeration. The machine itself becomes the scale reference. That is why this story still matters. Mount St. Helens is often remembered through the eruption column, the blast zone, the ashfall, the photographs of flattened timber, and the names of those who died. But machine history preserves another layer of the event. It shows what the eruption did to the industrial ground-level world beneath the headlines. Roads erased, work corridors buried, and heavy equipment turned into fixed points inside a new geologic deposit. The D7s under the Toutle mud are part of that hidden record. They tell us that the lahars were not secondary effects in any minor sense. They were valley-destroying flows capable of burying road systems, relocating channels, and entombing equipment designed for some of the hardest ground in America. They also tell us something about the limits of recovery. There are moments when steel loses the argument, not because the machine was weak, and not because the crew failed, but because the ground itself stopped being ground. The site is quieter now than it was in 1980, but the consequences remain. The Toutle Basin was permanently altered. Engineering works built after the eruption, including sediment control efforts and river management structures, exist because of the scale of material the mountain sent downstream. The buried bulldozers belong to that same chain of consequence. They are not side notes. They are part of the physical evidence of how completely the watershed was transformed. And that is the final image to hold on to. Somewhere beneath what became the reworked floor of a volcanic river system, Caterpillar D7s remained where the Lahar left them, blades and track frames sealed inside the deposit that ended their working lives in minutes. The machines are gone from sight. The lesson is not. In volcanic country, the machine may look powerful right up to the moment the valley changes shape around it. If you appreciate machine history told at ground level, subscribe. And if you have worked around debris flow country, unstable fills, or post-disaster cleanup, tell us what stands out to you here. Because this was not the last American bulldozer story written by moving ground.